Welcome everyone, good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis, the Director of the International Institute for Educational Planning. We do have simultaneous interpretation, and so please feel free to use the headphones if you wish. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome our esteemed guest and discussant. But before I do that, and Michaela will do so formally, I want to welcome all of you. This is the second in a series of strategic debates this year, this spring, focused on the new SDG agenda, and particularly SDG 4, the education goal. And this second one, we're focused on secondary education. And I'm pleased to announce that the third one is set for May 9th. Our former colleague, Eva Polak, will be speaking about higher education and SDG 4. So the contribution of higher education to achieving SDG 4. Let me also take the opportunity to inform you that on Monday next, which is April 11th, we will be holding a consultation, we will be hosting rather, the Global Education Monitoring Reports consultation on the 2017 concept note. It's on accountability in education. The concept note is online, and you are most welcome to come back on Monday to join the discussion. It will be in the auditorium, and it runs from 4 to 6 p.m., Monday, April 11th. Please come if your schedule allows. Thank you. So I'm very pleased that Keith Lewin has come. Keith is one of our latest authors. He authored the latest Fundamentals of Educational Planning series, and we're very pleased that he agreed to come and speak to us today. And of course, we also welcome Jordan Naidoo, who is Director of Partnerships and other things. What's the title? Education 2030. Partnerships and Education 2030 from headquarters. Jordan himself is a longtime friend of the Institute, having spent a year here writing back in the day. So allow me to turn it over to the organizer of our strategic debates, Ms. Michaela Martin. Michaela.
Thank you very much, Sue, for these welcoming words, and welcome everyone to this second strategic debate on this time on secondary education. So you know that the objective relating to secondary education in SDG 4 is particularly challenging because SDG 4 stipulates that secondary education should be provided free of charge till the study year 12, and it should be compulsory for 9 years. So the implications actually for SDG 4 for secondary education are tremendous. And this is why we thought that we should address this topic and look at a particular country, an important country, India, which is a country that is devoted to the development of secondary education. So India is venturing for universal secondary education by the year 2020. But the issue is actually how realistic is it, and what are the obstacles in the process. And this is what Keith will address today in his presentation. So I have a particular pleasure actually to present Keith and then Jordan. Keith is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Sussex. He is Professor in International Education and Development. He was the Director of the Center for International Education. He has worked extensively in many countries, including with international organizations such as UNICEF, UNESCO, the World Bank, and also with bilateral organizations. Key special interests lie in the areas of economics of education and development, policy analysis, financial planning, science and technology, strategies for development, including public-private partnerships. And KEYS can be proud of a list of publication of 15 books and over 100 referee journal articles and book chapters. I think it's quite obvious that we have a well-rounded specialist in international education with us who has worked in many different areas. And then our second speaker today, the discussant to KEYS presentation, will be Dr. Jordan Naidoo. As Sue said already, he is Director of Education for All and International Education, leading the global coordination of the SDG 4 Education 2030 Agenda. So he is Mr. Education 2030 Agenda, and he has also an extensive experience in education, and he worked as a senior education advisor at UNICEF in New York. He was Senior Director, Basic Education at Save the Children, and he received his PhD from Harvard University, I suppose in the area of education. Huh? So we have really two high-level and renowned speakers, and I particularly hope that they will speak to each other. So, Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michaela and Suzanne, for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in IIEP. Suzanne referred to my last book. My first book was actually here 30 years ago, so you'll find it in the catalogue. It was a book about education in recession, so I think it's probably still pretty relevant. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with my friend and colleague Jordan. We were in Vancouver last month talking about pretty much the same thing, which must mean that it's really important. So I hope you'll bear with us. I mean, I've had a passion for what happens to children between the ages of 12 and 20 since I started working as a professor of education. It's not, of course, that primary school is not important, of course it is. But it's what happens to children between the age of 12 and 20, what determines really your identity. It determines whether or not you have access to abstract thinking skills. And in a development sense, that's critical. Both identity and abstract thinking are at the core of development. If you don't have that abstract thinking skill, you're never, in a sense, going to be in the fast track. If your country doesn't have most of its people with abstract thinking, it's not a place where foreign direct investment is going to go. For all sorts of reasons then, getting it right in those years, which broadly speaking in the secondary school years, seems to me to be at the core of development. It's also very difficult. It's very difficult because there isn't really a consensus, a cross-national consensus, about what you do in the curriculum, about what the purposes of secondary school are, about whether it should be universal, whether it should be free. At what point do you charge people who can pay? All these questions. We disagree in one way or another. So, since we wrote a book after John Tier, if you read that book, which I wrote with Christopher Colcott, you'll find that there is a section in there about the problem of secondary school. It's not a problem that's just been invented. It's always been a core problem, because who goes to secondary school determines who gets what in all the countries you come from. It's one of those interesting facts that people are prepared to pay a lot more for secondary school than they do for primary school. What is that? In a lot of countries, people send their children to public primary schools and then try and send them to private secondary schools. It's never the other way round. So we know, everybody knows, it's important to get the secondary school cycle right. And yet, of course, in many countries, less than half the children get in the door of a secondary school, never mind complete it successfully. For 10 years, we ran a big program with the World Bank, Secondary Education in Africa program. That website's still open. It's got a lot of interesting stuff, studies that we did. And of course, you know, it is true, Africa has certainly progressed. Many countries in Africa now do have a majority of their children going through secondary school. That's no longer what it is, it remains a problem. But the real problem is, of course, what SACMET shows you, what TIMS shows you, about the differences in cognitive capability between OECD countries and low-income countries. The differences are vast. SEIA says something about that, and I'll be saying something about that today. But today I'm going to be talking about India, because we've just finished a 3-year research program on something called RMSA. RMSA is the national program to universalize access to and completion of secondary school in India. India, of course, is a country, but it's also a continent. Many of the states in India are bigger than most countries. So it's hugely diverse, hugely interesting, hugely important. Well, we've been working then with the Ministry of Human Resource Development and of course a team of Indian co-researchers, and in collaboration with the sister institute of IIEP with NUPA, the National University of Educational Planning. And you'll find much of what I'm going to say on one or other of the websites. There is a report which we've just completed, a synthetic report for the RMSA TCA, which contains pretty much everything I'm going to say this afternoon. But I'm using this really as a case study. It's a case study of what the challenges of the SDGs are in terms of how they're going to be different to EFA. The challenges of how the SDGs will be interpreted in the sense of policy and practice in relation to post-primary, secondary schooling and beyond. And I think it's an invitation to challenge you and everybody involved in the SDGs to say, hang on a minute, how is this different? If my grandmother was still alive, which unfortunately she isn't, and I showed her a copy of the EFA Jomtien or Dhaka agenda, and I showed her a copy of the SDGs, what would she say was the difference between them? I'd like to know. I think there could be many differences. There is a great opportunity. There's a great opportunity to stress that the SDGs should be about curriculum, not about learning. And that's obvious. Learning doesn't mean anything unless you have the curriculum, the view of the curriculum, what learning is worthwhile, that you put content into the idea of learning. What you learn is at the core of development, not just learning, it's what you learn, which of course is the central issue. So that's an opportunity. I've said in many different places, I think one of the challenges is to determine whether or not these SDGs represent sustainable educational development, which is the agenda of EFA, or whether they represent something different, which is called education for sustainable development, which carries with it the idea of substance, of curriculum, of content, of what's worth knowing. What would you do differently if you were concerned with sustainable development than if you were concerned simply with keeping the education system going and financing it? That's the old agenda. What's the new one? So I think those questions lie there. They certainly challenge India, but a very core concern as to whether or not you can teach the same things to all the people at the same time in a national core curriculum across 150 million children, some of whom are children of billionaires and other children of landless labourers who are illiterate. Can you put them all in the same room and teach them the same curriculum? I think not. But at the moment, India doesn't have a diversified secondary school curriculum. Probably needs it. So those are some of the issues. And if we start the slides now, we'll put some structure into it. So I'm told I have about 40 minutes. I still have 40 minutes because that was the introduction. And we're going to have a short break in the middle for reasons you'll see. So this is a debate. I hope I'm going to say things which will intrigue, tease, and irritate Jordan, so that he comes and tells me I'm wrong. Now, I was asked to talk about SDG 4.4, but I'm really talking about SDG 4.1. So for those of you who know what we're talking about here, there are 10 different things, and I'm very happy to talk about the rest of the SDGs, and I've written a few papers about this you'll find easily on the web, but that's not what I'm doing today. I'm just going to restrict myself to 4.1. So we've said by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. Okay, that's easy to agree. I think we said that in...
We're trying to put these lights out so that the screens...
I think we said that in Jump 10. Well, I know we said that in Jump 10 because I was there, and we said it also in DACA. It's not that one that's particularly different, although, of course, some people would say it explicitly mentions secondary schooling in a slightly different way. And, of course, Jomtien and Dakar also were concerned with learning outcomes. It simply isn't true that we live in a world now where it's access plus learning. It was always access plus learning. But let's not waste time on that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I showed you the cover of this document, which is a document produced by the Ministry of Human Resource Development in India. And we had a conference about a month ago in Delhi with the Secretary and the Joint Secretary and various other people to discuss the findings. The research program that we have been pursuing has got about 6 different elements to it, and there are some of the reports that are available if people are interested in the different aspects of it. But in a way, the reports tell a story, which is a story specifically about India, but which has many resonances in other countries. There are questions of flow, making it past elementary education, the flow of students. Demographic transition is a reality in most states in India and will have a huge effect on the demand side of the equation. India will become like China. In China, over 20 years, the number of children in primary school dropped from 150 to about 95 million. This is huge. It's 1/3 less children. So 1/3 less schools, but 1/3 or even more money to invest per child. Questions of equity, the obvious thing that differentiates high enrollment and low enrollment countries is the variation within the country between the best and the worst. The variation between schools in pupil-teacher ratios, the variation in enrollment rates between districts. You simply don't find that in high enrollment countries. So it conveys a lesson, and we've looked at how that pans out in India. We were surprised to find that more than half the secondary schools in India have less than 100 children. How do you run a secondary school with specialist teachers and a curriculum with that proportion of small secondary schools? I'm not saying it's impossible, and you can, although it's very rare, you can multi-grade secondary schools. But it clearly isn't optimal, nor is it actually necessary. It's very inefficient and very costly, and quite unlike China. And I talked about equity. I will talk about cost. I'll talk about the relationship with private sector. Although you can run what some people call low-price private schools at primary, it's virtually impossible to do this at secondary school level. You can't teach physics effectively with untrained teachers who don't know any physics. And people who are trained in physics generally don't want to work for nothing. So running a low-price school is an extremely difficult thing to do. So that, in one sense, pans out in a different way. And lastly, I think we were pretty horrified to confirm that more than 30 and probably 40% of Indian children have private tuition, for which they pay. And every person below the poverty line who pays for private tuition is by that act making themselves poorer. And what are they getting for it? It's not at all clear. So those are some of the issues that came out from the research. And because this is linked to a discussion of sustainable development, I'll just show you one picture. I think it's pretty obvious what that picture is. It's a small town actually in Bihar. And it's pretty much like that every day. Indeed, if you sit in a satellite, if you could go into space and look down, you will see a big brown cloud that sits over a large part of the centre of India, which is pollution, particulates. And there are other parts of the world which have the same problem. If we, that is this generation and the next, don't do something about this, we will all die, one way or another. We will certainly get lung diseases of one kind or another, and our children will. So somehow we have to sensitize people to the idea that there are different kinds of development. This is caused by development, but the solution to it is also development. And that's smart development, that's clever development, that needs the abstract thinking skills that people who go to secondary school ought to get. It needs also the kind of what a sociologist would call deferred gratification, the idea that you do things in the present for a bigger benefit in the future, which is central to the identity of people who acquire modern behaviours. You might want to discuss that. But the point about sustainable development, and one definition of sustainable development, is it is the ability to make decisions in the present that value the future more than the present. What we typically do, and what governments typically do, is value the present more than the future. We have to turn that upside down, otherwise that will get worse. And that, believe it or not, I think is the first picture of, what's that? It's the Earth. It's you, it's us. As soon as you see that, you can't, I think, escape from the idea that we're all in this together. What you do and what I do are not completely separate things. We interact. We live on that planet. And there are probably too many of us living on that planet, consuming too many things at the moment. We've got to somehow either consume less or be much cleaner and more effective about doing it. I'll come back to that. But that simple image is something that every child should see and discuss and think about and begin to understand in its many different dimensions. It tells you the planet is finite. There's only so much of it. It tells you that people who live here have got to get on with people who live there. If they don't like each other and they start throwing nuclear bombs around, none of us are going to be left. It contains lots of messages. And every child, every adult should be aware that they live on this planet, and that's what it is. Okay, so let me speed up a little bit. We organised this in a fairly obvious way by dividing up some of what we were doing into two considerations of access, efficiency, equity, and effectiveness. And as researchers, of course, we drove what we did by research questions, which came from the people involved in planning secondary schooling. I'm not going to read them all out. I think for a group of planners, it should be pretty obvious many of the questions that you would like to ask. So we organised them around what are some very important and obvious dimensions of access, efficiency, equity, and effectiveness. So let me tell you the story then that relates to India, which relates also to the SDGs. And a good friend of mine, who is well known here, I think, Chen Kai-ming, about 25 years ago, I was probably in this room or one of the rooms here. And I saw him give a presentation. He said, what I always do is give my conclusions first, so they can't run out of time. So I can't run. I'm just going to tell you the end of the story, and then you can go and have a cup of tea. So if we condense this into one PowerPoint slide, in terms of what the team decided it would be good if the MHRD had a dialogue around, it was this. It was, first of all, an issue about planning. I mean, what has happened in India is incredibly inefficient and ineffective at delivering a universal service. Some people might not thank me for saying that, but the evidence is abundant, and of course, many people in NUPA and elsewhere have said the same things. The planning system is not resulting in the efficient use of scarce resources, and that's the purpose of the planning system. So, first thing is to kind of fix that, keep working on it, and improve the implementation of the planning system so it does deliver what it should. Secondly, the problems of equity have proved extremely resistant to change in India. Here, of course, we're talking about educational equity, but it reflects larger inequalities in the society. If I was to quote a well-known Nobel laureate from India, he said the problem in India with equity, the problem is that we just don't talk about it. It's not a high-level debating question because the inequalities that exist are somehow stable over time and have proved, as I've already said, very resistant to change. Who goes to secondary school in India is the key determinant of who gets what. It's at the core of equitable development. Number of small schools at the secondary level is extraordinary. And indeed, it's the reason why India will not be able to universalise access to secondary schooling of quality unless it does address the problem of the very large number of small schools. It's a debating point. I mean, it's indeed a very important political point as to whether the Right to Education Act in India, which says every child should go to school between the age of 6 and 14, grade 1 to 8, should be extended to include the secondary. So, my answer is yes. I think the Indian government, under the 12th plan, has already said the answer is yes, because it said that by 2020, every child should complete secondary school. I didn't say that that was a legal condition, but it makes it part of the plan. So I think probably it should be, but it carries with it other implications. The Right to Education Act at the moment specifies that 25% of children in private schools, privately financed schools, should be children whose fees are being paid by the government and should be from scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, other backward castes and economically excluded groups. That's what's going to create a great debate in India as to whether or not that provision should be extended under the Right to Education Act. Although private schools have been growing, they clearly have limits to growth, which we've written a lot about, which mean that below the second quintile of household income, it's highly unlikely that anybody could afford private secondary school. It simply isn't a solution for those people in the corporate world who believe that it is. It can only be a reality if it's publicly financed. And of course, you could subcontract to private providers, but you would have to convince yourself that you can regulate effectively and efficiently for that to happen. Implications of expansion are indeed curriculum implications. What are you going to do? And are you going to do the same thing for every child? Because if you do, you will guarantee that many of them will fail. We already see the dropout rate and in grade 9 rising as the participation increases. The kind of things that you do in grade 9 and grade 10 in India, which involve abstract thinking skill, are too difficult for many of the children who are being admitted. They fail and they drop out. The problem has to be addressed. It is a curriculum problem. And last three things there. Of course, it wouldn't be the case that children were in secondary school who couldn't perform at the level of national curriculum says they should, if there had been an effective management of learning through the system. Formative assessment of children and intervention. So just as it shouldn't be possible to reach grade 6 and not read, it's only possible to reach grade 6 and not read if you have no formative assessment on the way through it. And the same thing, of course, applies higher up. The private tuition problem could be at least partly diffused by offering on a very large scale, and it's cheap to do actually. They put private tuition type stuff online, create MOOCs, mass online courses that are free, so that people who can't afford private tuition can kind of get it for free. I don't know that that would solve the problem, but it's better than doing nothing. And of course, every child should have a trained teacher in front of them, which is far from the truth at the moment. So we've got lots of evidence, lots of research-based evidence on all those points that justifies why we advocate putting those at the core of a dialogue about what to do about secondary schooling. And so access. These were some of the questions that we had. Let me give you some data and you'll see how it pans out. And whilst I'm talking, you can ask yourself, what's it like in my country? Are these things of demographic transition taking place? Do we have small secondary schools? Does every child have a trained teacher in front of them? So you'll find that the issues resonate. So here's a typical enrolment chart pattern over time, over the last 10 years or so, and you can see how enrolments by grade have been changing. Below grade 4, there are more children in school than there are in the age group. There are overage children. Above that, there is a tipping point, and it's around grade 4 at the moment, and of course it should be around grade 9 or grade 10. And in an OECD country, it is around grade 10 or 12. Grade 12. So India has a way to go. This curve is shifting a bit towards the flat line, the population line, I should say. But clearly, there are a lot of children here who are not getting to the secondary grades. So things are happening, but it's India, a vast continent. In different parts of India, it's very different. That's a single age group of children, and this is the tipping point. Tipping point in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries is around about the same place, somewhere between grade 3 and grade 5. And with the high enrollment countries, of course, it's grade 8, or grade 9, as in South Africa, and the lowest enrollment countries in the Sahel could be only grade 2 or 3. So we hope that curve is going to shift, but it will shift. These are some states, and for those who know about India, these are very large states with anywhere between 50 and 150 million people, or even 200. What does it look like? Well, those are the enrollment curves. These are the secondary grades up here. So it's very obvious in Bihar, the number of children reaching secondary and successfully completing it is well below 50%. It's more like 30%. Has been improving, yes, but a long way to go. Certainly not going to be realised in the next 5 years. That would be an unbelievable rate of progress. Tamil Nadu, of course, is completely different. Tamil Nadu has had pretty much universal participation in grade 10 for the last 10 years. So is Andhra Pradesh, so is Kerala, so a number of other states. So they are different, and the demographics are different between the states. But the problem of universalizing participation and completion clearly is very different in the states. There's a very long data series here we've reconstructed from 1970 to 2014. Things do change. Development does happen in different ways in different places. This top line then is Kerala, a high enrollment place where everybody goes to secondary school. Tamil Nadu, which is the brown line here, used to be like Bihar. But Tamil Nadu transformed itself on this subject and created mass participation in secondary level in a way that Bihar completely failed to do. Is this because, well, why did this happen? It's obviously to do with the political economy of the state, the political will. It may be to do also with economic development, but these two things are not independent. Tamil Nadu is now much richer than Bihar per capita. UP, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh and Kerala. Kerala is the top one. Yeah. Bihar, sorry. Yeah. are low enrolment states and remain low enrolment states, although they don't necessarily spend less money on the subject. Sorry about the political economy. Some people would say, well, this is about the Government of India's plan to universalise access to secondary school, which was announced around 2007. Absolutely not. This result cannot be the result of current policy because the time lags are wrong. This is actually the result of SSA. It's the result of the pressure of increased numbers leaving the primary school system that have started demanding secondary school places. Who are the new students? A very important question, because you can see these are the poorest children and these are the richest, the 5 quintiles, rich and poor. So in Gujarat, no more than about 15% of children in secondary school are from the poorest quintile, even 10%. Whereas pretty much 80, 90, 100% of the richest are in secondary school. These are huge differences. These are children with completely different cultural capital, language, reading levels, support from their parents, and so on and so on. Kerala, you see, the poorest and the richest. Not a lot of difference. Completely different environment for RMSA. Now this one really, I think, is interesting. I thought the other ones were interesting, but this is really interesting. This is enrolled by 1 quintile over a 7-year period, and this is a national sample. This is the Indian National Household Survey. And we're looking here at the wealth groups, poorest and the richest. And what's happened? Well, what's happened is that in 2014, in Delhi, the richest group improved their participation from about 60 to 90%. But the poorest 3 quintiles didn't change. The gains were all amongst the richest people. So the direct effect of RMSA, in building new secondary schools and stuff, was that the people who benefited weren't the poorest at all. They were the middle income and the richest. And if we look across different states in India, we see characteristic different patterns. We've got a tuning fork here, where the poorest just didn't get any better. Nothing happened to them. Kerala, which I mentioned before, actually the poorest got the biggest gain in Kerala. There's something about what the government of Kerala was doing. We created a very different result to what the state government in Delhi did. Or in Andhra Pradesh, where you see this is the middle class effect. It's people in the middle who've got the biggest gain in Andhra Pradesh. So what's happening in your country, and what will happen? And how do you design policy so that you get more of this and less of that, if you're interested in equity? It's fundamental. As soon as you present it that way, if you understand what you're looking at, then I think you put in people's minds a problem which they may not have seen before. Okay, demographic transition. These are the number of children, 2-year-olds, 4, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and so on, in a whole bunch of states here. This is Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. The simple message here is that these are 6 to 8-year-olds. The number of 0 to 2-year-olds is about 20 or 30% less. Those children are flowing through. They will arrive in secondary school by 2020. And the number of people, number of places that need to be provided will be falling. And it's falling in all these states. And in these states, it's already falling. This is demographic transition big time. It's very good news from the planning point of view because you need less school places. It's the problem though if you continue to plan on the basis of yesterday's census, because you will build places, schools in places where the children no longer are. When you couple demographic transition with urban migration. So you see big movements in where children actually are, where they're likely to be. It's a truism, of course, that a lot of planning used to assume that the biggest problems were in rural areas in low-income countries. Well, they aren't anymore. Indeed, in many low-income countries, most people are not in rural areas. They're either in cities or they're around cities, in informal settlements and so on and so on. So the demography of where children are and what they need has changed fundamentally. But there will be fewer children, not everywhere, but in more countries than not. And certainly in pretty much every state in India. For those who like these comparisons, India is a good generation, possibly two, behind China in terms of participation by grade, boys and girls, rich and poor. India is a long way behind. We talk about the BRICS as if Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa were somehow similar. Absolutely not. South Africa doesn't look anything like this either. So why do we group them together? It's just a piece of bankers' journalistic convenience, actually. It's structurally not justified. It just sounded like a good story in Time or Newsweek, wherever it was originally used. Okay, efficiency. I'm not sure how the time's going, I'm sure it's flying. Efficiency. School size. This is staggering. Now here we have the percent of schools that have less than 50 children in secondary grades, and it's nearly 25% of all schools in India. 80% of schools, primary schools in India, have 3 teachers or less. They have 5 grades. De facto, they should be multi-grade, but many of them aren't. The situation at secondary schools, surprisingly, is at least as bad, if not worse, in terms of how do you deliver a quality curriculum, a national curriculum, when you've got one class, 50 children across 2 grades. Or maybe you've got 2 classes. It's going to be expensive, it's not going to be very good. And yeah, the peaks with 51. In terms of economies of scale, in a conventional secondary school, you would reckon that you need 400 or 500 children before you start, before you get diseconomies of scale. But you don't want it much smaller than that. There's another way of looking at the same thing. The number of states in which the number of small schools is decreasing. These are states where it's going down, and these are states where it's going up. But the key thing about the map is the same. It's the same message. Between 50 and 70% of these schools are below 150. They're all very small. And there's a GIS. Can we do GIS? The rule, you see, the norm in India says the school should be a 5-kilometre radius. These schools are within a 2-kilometre or even a 1-kilometre radius. They've been building them like crazy because the political economy of providing jobs, teachers, government, has completely overruled the rational planning approach, which says you simply don't need this number of schools. This is why you are spending not 2% of state GDP, but probably 5%. Vast amount of money. And you won't universalise access. And even if you do, it's not going to be very good. These places are next door to each other. Now, of course, there are parts of India where the population density is very low. But this intensity of small schools is much more a question of political economy and how you site schools. And clearly, a norm, 5-kilometre norm, doesn't solve the problem at all. A different solution is needed. And it has a consequence. So this is pretty much what happens to the cost per student in relation to school size. As you would expect, it takes off exponentially. And if your school, this is pretty optimistic, but 250 and above, the costs start to stabilise. This is for a 2-grade secondary school. But anything below that, it starts taking off. And it could be 8 times as expensive per child. So it comes at a price. It would be much better to have half the number of secondary schools with twice the quality, or a quarter of the number of secondary schools with 4 times the quality. This would be for the benefit of 4 or more children. The qualification rate of teachers in secondary school is unacceptably low. And the trend there is giving you a line that says even in the largest schools, only 40% of them have 4 teachers in maths, science, language who are properly qualified in social studies. And of course, the situation is much better in government schools, and it's very poor in private secondary schools. These are not qualified. Resource-wise, the schools that have a computer, a computer facility, a science lab, and a library, all of these things, we're down below 10%. Most schools don't have at least one, if not 2 or 3 of those things. So there's a long way to go. I say stop, I'm stopping. But I'm going to start again. Now the reason is this. You've got timer on the bottom here, and you've got attention. So when I started talking, you listened. And if I ask you what I said, you'll remember what I said in the first 3 minutes. But if I ask you what I said for the last 10 or 15 minutes, you'll remember a little bit, maybe. Your attention will be falling off. If I do something like this, you start paying attention. So we're going to stop now for a minute. I want you to speak to the person next to you about one thing I said that relates to sustainable development in secondary school. That will bring your blood sugar levels back. Okay, so we're going to do this. We're not going to have a 45-minute lecture, we're going to have a little break. So, talk to the person next to you, and I won't start unless everybody says something. You see, I've just demonstrated that I know something that Fidel Castro didn't know. Fidel Castro famously would give a speech for 12 hours, unaware of the fact that everybody was asleep. I know this, and every teacher should know this. And of course, with primary school children, that attention span, we're talking minutes. We're certainly not talking 10 or 20 minutes. And with secondary school children, it's the same. So when you see a school timetable organised with 2-hour periods, you think, what's going on? Who's away? Anyway, so we interrupt the flow here, and you'll now remember the things I say for the next 2 minutes. We're talking about equity. Who goes to secondary school is a core issue everywhere. And it is strange that people are prepared to pay a lot more for secondary school than for primary school. And it's very much about who gets what. Because secondary schools allocate qualifications, they provide access to the labour market, they provide access to thinking skills, which are of course related to income. Longer story if you want to contest that. So what about equity? Well, here are a few things. This of course is from the inequality database. And this happens to be South Asia, but you see these very wide spreads in participation between the richest and the poorest. And of course, you don't see them in OECD countries. There are differences in OECD countries, but you don't see them. And Thailand, of course, is becoming like OECD countries. In terms of access to secondary school, it's a pretty fair place. But India is absolutely not. India's got one of the largest differences between the completion rates of secondary between the rich and the poor. Another way of looking at that, these are curves poorest and the richest. These are public schools and these are private schools. And you see a pretty perfect crossover here. If you're poor, you go to a public school, and if you're rich, you go to a private school. With what consequence? Well, you may well ask. Certainly the consequence is likely to be that your society, the stratification of your society will reflect that, and it will probably reproduce that over time, with whatever consequences that may have for your national development. If you select the next generation of leaders from the families of the wealthy, you won't be selecting the most capable people. We know that with the British royal family, and you may know that from your own experience. Efficient societies and equitable societies don't do that. Looked at another way, in every country you can draw this curve, draw your own. This is a curve which says this is the 10% poorest households, 10% richest. If it were possible to send your child to a private school, how much would it cost you? And the answer is, in India in general, you'd have to spend 80% of your total income on one child. It's obviously impossible. So it's no solution to the provider of last resort problem, who provides secondary schools for poor people. Well, it's clearly not going to be private, commercially rigid providers, but it sort of invites a bigger question, which is who's the provider of first resort? There is a myth in many countries that the best schools are all private. It's not true in England, it's not true in England, and it's not true in India. There are schools, notably Kendriya and Navodaya Vidyalayas, which are run by the state, which get scores which are very equivalent to high-end private schools, which cost lots of money. It's a longer story, and I've got time to tell you what those schools are. But there are 700 a lot of schools run by the state, very successful, very effective. If you look at the best scoring schools in England, and you look outside the top 50, but you look at the top 500, and we have 5,000 secondary schools, then the majority of the top 500 scoring schools are public or private. And in India, across the states here, the proportion of children in truly private schools is around 20%, possibly 30%. But that's not the proportion of children, remember that. It's the proportion of children who are enrolled. And if the enrollment rate's only 50%, then the proportion of children is half that. And that makes sense. That says that in India, on average, 15 to 20% of children, which of course is equivalent to the top quintile, just possibly the second quintile, are in private schools. And if you look at the scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, other backward castes, which is an Indian way of classifying people, and people who are not disadvantaged by caste, this group. You see something similar to what we had before with all students. Who benefited 207 through 14? Well, the poor didn't. The participation of these children didn't get any better, despite the fact that scheduled tribe and scheduled caste people have quotas of special arrangements. But the people who benefited most of those were within those groups who were richer. So it's in a sense the same story. And it's a question of public policy and how you actually make things more equitable, more efficient, and more effective. Because if you don't act, if you just kind of do it, this is what happens. People in the middle and the people at the top get most of the benefit. And surprisingly, if we look at what people spend their money on, these are households, these are the poorest group, what are they spending their money on? They're spending their money on fees, school fees. This is in public schools. And they're spending even more than that on book, stationery, and uniform here. So they're spending pretty much as much on private tuition. These are the poorest people. These aren't on $1 a day poverty. Well, certainly less than $2. So everybody in there is getting poorer as a result of having to pay for books, for travel, for school fees. Why on earth would you be charging these people school fees? Because you're increasing the number of people in India who are formerly in poverty. And even worse, if these people are borrowing money, which they do, for private tuition, we know that in Bihar, for example, the pretty average rate of rural credit would be at least 8% interest a month. That's a month. So that's 120, 140 a year. You don't escape from that, you just generate more debt. So it's a very bad idea, particularly if you want those people to be in the system. And the states spend different amounts of money. And kind of interesting that there's no real correlation between how much you spend on education in the state and how much you spend on secondary school. It's not a linear relationship you might expect it to be. This reflects clearly political decision making. So Uttar Pradesh, which is a very large state, effectively has left secondary schooling to the private sector. And there isn't very much of it because it's only inhabited by rich people. It does spend a lot of money on primary schooling, which is where most of that 4% is going. The states differ greatly. One size clearly won't fit all. And last of the four, effectiveness. These were the percent taking private tuition. It is very high, 30% on average of those who are in secondary school. And they're probably borrowing money. We find something else actually, and this is also very alarming. In some states, but not necessarily others, the attendance rates are astonishingly low. These attendance rates down here at 30% is the daily attendance rate of a school. You have 1,000 children in the school and only 200 or 300 turn up. At which point you say, well, slow down, there's no point in building more of these schools until we work out why people aren't going there and what they're doing. And part of the answer is that they're going for private tuition instead. Not as well, but instead. And that scholarships which are being paid to encourage children to attend secondary school, which in some states go to pretty much all children except so-called normal boys, are being used to finance the private tuition industry, not to improve the quality of the school. So it seems perverse, it seems upside down. That money could have been invested in things which would have improved the quality of the school and reduced the demand for private tuition. Does private tuition work? Well, lots of people believe that it does, but we've just done a true RCT in England on a system that we have where parents can demand one-to-one tuition of their children if they're falling behind in mathematics. It's in public schools. So you get 1 hour a week of private tuition, one-to-one. And we looked at this for 2 years and we've spent millions of pounds on it. And we cannot find any difference in performance of these children. The ones who got it, the ones who didn't. Now maybe you would say they didn't get enough of it. You can't say the tuition was no good because we know it was good, because we have videos of what they were doing and so on. So they were actually doing a good job. It just didn't have the effect that people thought. Let me skip that one. This is the secondary school curriculum for the Common Board exam, which is the most high status national assessment in grade 10. And the one thing I want to draw your attention to is that there are 48 periods a week. How many periods are there in your school system? Do you know? 40. That's high. Which country is that? Right. Anybody beat 40?
Sri Lanka.
How many in Sri Lanka?
40.
40 also. Yeah, well in England there's about 22 or maybe 24. Why do your children need so much more? I don't understand. The number of hours that formerly children are supposed to receive is much greater. And that's without the private tuition. But clearly there are a big set of issues here about the intensity of what's happening within the school. Whether this is very inefficient. Why do you need so much of it? And isn't there a point at which you will saturate? You know, how many hours a day can you study? Well, 24 is the maximum. But you'd need to be on drugs to stay away, wouldn't you? 20 hours. In some countries, children are habitually spending more than 10 hours and even 12 or 14 hours a day studying. Why? Why are we doing this to people? What is it they're learning? What is it they need to learn that takes so long? Why don't rich countries do this? Because they don't. That curriculum can't be realised in a school with 50 children or 100 children. It simply can't be done. There's too much of it and would require too many teachers. And the last point on this then is, it's about what's going on in the dynamics of the school system. If the SDGs end up being, or should be, at least in part, a curriculum question and a learning set of questions about who's learning more. One way of constructing this discourse is to say, well, where are we on this? I mean, this happens to be PISA maths, but it could be science or language. We've got different countries here, or different groups of countries. Shanghai stands on its own because it doesn't have a normal distribution. Of course, what this means in a technical sense is simply the test is too easy for children in Shanghai. They can do it without waking up. If we extended the test and made it more difficult, then we'd end up back with a distribution. OECD countries, and of course the test is effectively standardized on OECD expectations, end up with this curve here, the dotted line. And most of these groups of countries, this would account for about 30 or 40 PISA countries between there and there, are effectively the same in terms of their distribution. Their average is a little bit different, but it's not so different that you would ever see it reflected in national development. It simply wouldn't cause you to invest in this country or that country, but that certainly would. Now, the Indonesian, is this Indonesia? Yes, but Kazakhstan and a few other countries look like that. This test is far too difficult for most people in that country. And if you're looking for a labour force that's got lots of abstract thinking and skill, and certainly in mathematics, I'm afraid they're not there at the moment. What do you do about it? I don't know. The Indonesian government said that by 2020, it would like to have a curve that looked like the OECD. And I gave a seminar there and somebody said that, and I said, why? You are bound to fail. Surely you should be thinking, what does Indonesia need? What's a staged process if you really want to end up in the same place? But maybe you don't want to end up in the same place. I mean, there's no universal law that says everybody has to do the same amount of mathematics everywhere. The economy is different, and what people enjoy and what is different. And there is a high risk that you set yourself in a pathway where you will fail. Okay, well, so those are the groups of countries. My question about India is like a large collection of countries, is what do they look like? Do they look like Indonesia or do they look like Singapore? Does Delhi look like Singapore? The answer is at the moment we don't know because there is no national testing system in India which convincingly answers that question. But there's certainly cause for concern. There was a trial at PISA in 2009, and this was the result. That's the OECD curve. This is Tamil Nadu, which may surprise people, and Arunachal Pradesh, which did indeed look like they had a long tunnel. So, universalist secondary schooling, yes, that's fine. But it's a curriculum question. What are you going to do in it? If you do PISA, everybody will fail. If your maths curriculum is OECD standard PISA, then I'm afraid everybody will fail, or you'll. So that's clearly not going to be the best way forward. Okay, so just to confirm that, this is national data from India. It shows you've got a left-leaning curve. What that means is that these children are being asked to do things that are too difficult with their teachers in the schools that they've got. These are small schools with lots of unqualified teachers and so on and so on. So I suppose if, if you pull this round in a circle, it's yet another reminder that expanding access to secondary schooling in a developmentally beneficial way is a curriculum issue. It's a curriculum issue. You've got to work through what's worth teaching and what can be taught and what value it has developmentally, over what time period, progression, in order to square the circle involved in that. So here I return full circle to where I started, with a set of propositions that we thought encapsulated many of the important evidence-based conclusions that we were able to locate from the research. That the planning system wasn't actually doing what it should do. It wasn't. The planning system itself is perfectly rational and it sounds like it should work. Something's going wrong with the implementation. Something's going wrong with the transposition of the norms and the standards to the events on the ground that create all these small schools, or the lack of teacher supply. There are huge differences that relate to the chances of different kinds of children going to secondary school. If you are a low-income, rural, minority group girl, then you've probably got somewhere between a 15th and a 20th of the chance of going to secondary school than an ordinary person in a big city. This certainly can't be right. It's certainly not equitable. You could, I think, say it's probably unconstitutional, and it's certainly not a good idea in the long term. The question of small schools has to be addressed. The big issue about the Right to Education Act, I think, sits there as, should this be compulsory? What does it mean to make it compulsory? And are you going to extend the Right to Education Act to say that every private school should have 25% of its enrolments from poor people? The private sector certainly doesn't want that, and is fighting high court cases at the moment to prevent it. And it's not for outsiders to take a view on that. It's up to the Indian political system. But it has to address the question of, whatever you do about that, how do you finance secondary schooling for people who can't pay? And how do you manage the relationship between the public and private sector so that people don't build private schools next to good public schools and destroy them by draining away their enrollments and their best teachers and everything else? It's a very important question. The curriculum issues won't go away, and they are SDG issues. It is a learning problem, and it's certainly an assessment problem, but the assessment problem is not so much about the need for national monitoring exams. The problem is about embedding formative assessment on a regular basis in every school, so that the learning of every child is managed. This would have far more effect if you were able to do that. And that, of course, is the difference between the more successful and less successful schools, districts, and states. Those things do happen. Undermining the private tuition industry, in the sense of giving people a fairer chance than they currently have, I think it's a great thing to do. Learning should be free. It should be available without copyright, without the sense that you have to pay somebody to get knowledge. And that's what states are good at doing. And lastly, of course, the problem of qualified teacher supply is absolutely the business of government, because nobody else's business. So I think if all those things were addressed in ways in which we go into in a great deal of detail, then this map of participation in India would be transformed. It would create the opportunity to move, at least partly, from what is becoming a very exam-oriented system with lots of overhead on learning and lots of cost. It's distorting the economy. It's not necessarily selecting the most capable people. It's certainly favouring those with more rather than less assets. And it stores up problems for the future in terms of inequality and potential social conflict around the labour market, the access to jobs, and all these other things. So I think we've got a pretty good story there, and a story that can easily be mapped not in detail, but in general, onto the dilemmas that most countries will face in terms of managing the growth of secondary schooling. And with that, I think I'll leave you with those thoughts. Before Jordan speaks, we're going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to have another little attention and spend refresher. So thank you very much for listening. Speak to the person next to you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for a full menu of issues on a country that is actually in advance of achieving SDG 4, because the Indian government plans to universalize the secondary education by the year 2020. Yeah? So that's, of course, an ambitious agenda given the regional disparities in the country. And there are, I think, a full set of issues. And we are quite interested to hear what Jordan has to say about this from UNESCO's perspective.
Yeah, I'm sure whether I can circles that.
They'll remember more of what you say if you give them a minute.
That's right. Like Keith said initially, I'm also really glad to be back at IIEP. I come more often, or less often than I like, but I spent a year, about 12, 13 years ago, and it's always a pleasure to be back, and it's a pleasure to follow Keith. As he said, we share a lot of common views, but we also disagree often on certain key things. So I'm going to start with what Keith mentioned. A good friend and colleague of ours, Kamin Chen, said to start with the conclusion. My first conclusion, perhaps, is to go back to the question: universalizing secondary education in India, is SDG 4 achievable? I will come back. I know really like to thank Keith for a very comprehensive analysis of the challenges of universalizing secondary education in India. And he's presented, a very complex picture about some of the things that are possible if you do certain things. However, my conclusion is I'm left with a bit of an empty feeling. I'm not so sure that Keith has answered that question, or he's proposed a number of things, but I want to challenge him and come back to the end and to try to pin him down to, is it possible or not? So we'll come back to that. But I want to go back, and before reflecting on some of the specifics that he raised with regard to India, I think the India position, as he said, is both in terms of it being a country with such a large population and virtually a continent on its own. I think all of the issues he raised, both in terms of the possibilities, the impossibilities, and some of the possible solutions, have implications for the rest of the world. I think since we have, 4.1 as universal secondary education, it's an ongoing debate, and I will touch upon that a little. But I think we have to be, really appreciative of the work that's being done by Keith and his team in India, because it offers us some options at least to consider as the debate moves forward. So that's the first point. And I think just reflecting back on the experience within the development of the SDGs as a whole, through the consultations over the last 3 to 4 years, and then the intense debates within the open working group, I think it's an issue for SDG 4 that recurred about this question of ambition and expansion. And I think it's interesting that Keith mentioned that India is committed to universalizing secondary education by 2020. This is quite, I think, in a sense, contradictory to the position that India adopted within the open working group discussions and in the discussions at the World Education Forum, because India was quite insistent. The minister that was there made it quite clear that India did not support 4.1. And particularly the compulsory junior secondary up to 10 years, because of the fact that the RTE only guaranteed 8 years. So this was, and it was put on record that while India went along with 4.1, they wanted it noted that objection. So I think it's an interesting dynamic as they move forward. Going back, I think in looking at the SDGs, there have been a number of criticisms, but what is clear in terms of the, both the Transforming Our World global document across all SDGs and then the following documents that we have in the Education 2030 Framework for Action, it's clear that, it is supremely ambitious. It is quite, it's a transformational vision that envisages a world with universal literacy and with equitable and universal access to quality education at all levels. And I think this, perhaps, Keith, if I may add, is one of the big differences with John T. because I think there, even though it intimated this question of looking at literacy and looking at education from a lifelong perspective, it was not explicit. I think in this case, even if it becomes an empty promise, it's there. It's something that presidents have agreed to, at the UN. Almost everybody, without question, have accepted that as the goal for the next 15 years. So I think that's one of the critical differences. One of the things to consider, and this is where I want you to come back to answering the question specifically, is that in the since the release of the SDGs and the debate that's ongoing, there's been a lot of criticism from a number of quarters about the level of ambition. From varying quarters, both from the left and right. Basically, the issue raised is that it's impossible to meet many of the targets, and even the target 4.1 with regard to universal secondary education. Some have questioned it from perspectives of financing, and others have even questioned it in terms of need. Do all countries actually need universal secondary education? I know, and I'm glad Keith pointed that out, that you need some form of post-secondary, post-primary education from the perspective of building abstract thinking. And I think I would go beyond abstract thinking. I think we do need to educate children beyond 12 or 14 years of age in a much more innovative way. Because it's not only about abstract thinking. I think everything you need to become fully actualized individuals who can contribute to society both economically, but I think more from all aspects of life, require development that is in those critical adolescent years between 14 and 18. And some or the other, whether it's through formal secondary or other means, we need pathways that provide those opportunities, whether they're in public systems, private, or I think it's still the state's responsibility to ensure that that happens equitably, as you pointed out. So I think that's a critical element we should not forget. Coming back to the criticisms, I know it surprised me a little that what you presented in terms, again, coming back to that question was slightly different from what you said in Vancouver. So I want to come back to that question because, like I said, the GMR and a number of others, ranging from the Economist to Lewin and Kraft, I really criticized the ambition, and I think even a recent ODI study has pointed out that it would be impossible to meet that target, and they've actually projections done by ODI have said that we would not reach more than 80% of access for 15 to 24-year-olds in the next 15 years. So I think that's an important, no matter what's done, unless there's a dramatic shift in the ability to provide access, the situation will not change very much for many countries. And I think this question of 80% is important because, as you've stated, the variation within India, from those that are least able to provide to those like Kerala and others, the same situation exists globally. We will have many countries that are 100% gross enrollments, even beyond 100%, yet we will still have countries like Niger and others that will not go beyond even, it will struggle to even reach 50%. So I think that issue is quite important. I think one of the other things in this debate, the criticism has come very much from economists and from people from a very technical position. If we look at the position of civil society, almost every civil society group has championed 4.1 and have insisted that no matter how aspirational that target is, it is something that governments are obligated to try to deliver. So I think that's an important point to note. But I want to come back to what Keith identified as some of the challenges. I think those challenges we have to acknowledge are very real, concrete, and quite daunting. So we do need measures that will be taken that can address them. And I'm not going to go through the list, but in terms of the 4 areas of access, efficiency, equity, and efficiency, I think Keith outlined about 10 possible things that need to be done or could be done based on the India experience that may help us, if not reaching that universal goal, but at least shift towards that quite substantially in many of these very challenging contexts. So I think that's quite, in some ways, despite all of the challenges, it is also promising and kind of gives us some hope that the progress is possible even in the most difficult of circumstances. So I think the issue, I think, for many of us is that we need more studies, we need more research in different contexts to see how some of those solutions play out in practice, taking into account that it's not only always about the solution that is offered, but how it can be implemented in a particular context. I think those dynamics within the context will often affect even the policy and planning and so on. As you pointed out, I think the most critical factor across the ability to deliver on any of those are the political economy questions. So I think that remains the biggest factor on whether even those proposed solutions based on the India experience will or will not work. I think, do I have more time?
You can take 2-3 minutes.
Okay, I think I've spoken very generally. Now to some of the things specifically on India.
5 minutes.
I think in terms of what Keith said, it is important that the focus is on curriculum and on learning, and actually the outcomes are very important, particularly in terms of secondary education. If it's merely a matter of getting another paper qualification, then the investment is not worth it. I think it is about secondary education, affording children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds an opportunity to transform their own lives as well as those around them. So I think that's the first important issue. It is about equity, and equity will change through many different ways, but the culture of what happens in the classroom and what is learned and taught has to be the focus. I'll come back to that. I think in terms of India, there's some things that were a bit difficult to follow, particularly the demographic changes. I think the issue you raised about the drop in numbers of children in the early years is important, but the immediate problem is that you have a bounce right now in terms of 15 to 24-year-olds. In India, actually, this is not often recognized. Of the young people in that age group, the population of 15 to 20-year-old, India makes up 60% of the global population, almost 1.3 billion. So I think that's an important factor. The government has to deal with that immediate issue. So even if we look at the demographic change over the 15 years, I think over the next 5 years, that's a challenge that has to be addressed. So that's one important thing to consider. And I think looking at this comparison between the BRICS, even though there's such differences, I think it's an important comparison between China and India to make in terms of the economic growth. And why I say that is, for much of the growth that India's had in the recent years has been through investment and its growth in secondary education. Despite all of the challenges, there has been substantial growth. I think between 93 and 2010, almost 10% increase for both males and females. And I think this has contributed, and then the impact then on even doubling of or more than doubling in higher education, and particularly the contribution to high income jobs related, particularly in technology. And I think that has been a driver of growth in the economy, which has to be recognized. So there has to be that continued investment. And that's one important point to note. The second point, I think, in terms of the link to social and economic development is also the fact that if you look at the ratio of the youth worker population, there's distinct difference between those that have secondary access versus primary. It's almost 10% or more in terms of the unemployed versus the employed. And this is also coming back to the number of current youth. The unemployment rates among the 15 to 25-year-olds is almost 3 times as high compared to the general population. So it is a challenge for the Indian government in terms of addressing that. But just to come back to some of the things that I really liked in terms of the analysis. I think the analysis in terms of focusing both on the supply issues that have to be addressed, including the insufficient and uneven distribution of school infrastructure, or as you said, these pockets of inefficiencies, concentration is a critical issue, particularly for secondary schooling. I think the issue you raised on the availability of targeted teachers who were trained to do the job at the secondary level across those critical subjects is an undeniably important issue. Then I think the question of private sector and how it is used is a critical question. And in the India examples that you've been given, I think it clearly illustrates it's a suboptimal use of private resources. It's actually, as you pointed out, it creates more inefficiencies in the system, it's created greater inequities and so on. Yet, if used properly, it could have been a different picture. Is it possible to use it differently? That's the question I would pose. Then also, I think the other issue I think you've not covered, which I think would have may be interesting to look at, given the large out-of-school population in India, it's one of the biggest in the world, are there any alternative pathways or provisions for providing opportunities either through the formal system or through other means? Because you're still going to have that age group, and in fact in the Indian case I think it's close to 2 million, who need to be accommodated with opportunities to build skills to engage more effectively in society and life. So that's the issue I think that needed some attention. And finally, just to come back to the question, I think the issue of the demand side issues that you raised are very important. The point, especially in terms of the impact and equity and the amount of money that the poorest have to contribute even for the worst forms of learning that is offered. I think that's a critical issue. If that doesn't change, then many of the attempts to universalize will flounder even more. And just to conclude, I think I think there has to be some other innovative options to deliver and promote access to quality post-primary education. I think it's an obligation on every country to do that. Whether we achieve it or not, I have some doubt that it will be universal. Whether we need universal access is another question. But at least I think the aspiration should not fall short. We should continue to impose pressure on every single system to attempt to deliver at least. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, for shedding some light on some of the controversies that you were facing when discussing the 2030 education agenda. And I found it also interesting that India, despite the fact that it is making so rapid advance in the development of its secondary schooling coverage, was really kind of taking a rather conservative position in the discussions. And, thank you also relating so tightly to some of the issues that Keith has mentioned, and I can see clearly that you have the opportunity, or you have the opportunity to talk to each other, and that you relate very well to each other's debates. Huh? So I think we can open the floor for some questions and comments. I would like to invite you to present yourself, your position, your country, and I suggest that we take some 3 questions in a row, and then we ask our speakers to respond, and then we go for a second round.
Can we give them a break just for 2 minutes?
I think they're so passionate. They're so passionate that.
Talk to the person next to you about the question you want to ask.
Yeah.
Go.
Okay, so talk to your neighbor about the question you would like to ask. Yes.
Financially, yes. Demographically, yes. Curriculum. Politically, I think that's the questions. It's not the most
Since this is about education, I want to go back to my role as a school mistress and invite some questions and comments. Shreya, so we have somebody from India and we have another student. I don't know your name, but I got your email. So we have 2 Indians. I think that's very interesting that we start with some comments from Indians. Huh? So and the third one I take okay, then well, super hot. Okay, we go for first round and then you will be in the second round. Huh? So can I invite then Shreya to come forward and ask her question?
Yes.
Oh yes.
Let's see. Hello, I'm Shreya. So I work with Michaela. And I come from Gujarat, which performed the worst in terms of equity on your which is sort of shameful. Anyway, so my question is about incentive to go to school. The people I've talked to in India, people who dropped out of school, one of the problems I have in convincing them to go to school is, providing them incentives. The problem is the opportunity cost to go to school is higher in terms of what you would earn otherwise just doing street labor. It has also long-term incentive problems in the sense that you talked a lot about having these abstract ideas, but what we need concretely in short term is to give concrete skills that can be applied in short term, vocational skills. And I think there is this entire norm in India to really focus on science, it's all about science. But because these skills are not concrete, you can't go out and write a proper email, What you need, according to me, is very strong vocational skills, especially because there is such a high dropout after the 10th grade. And even retention post 10th grade is very low. So my question to you is what kind of incentive system you can create to fill in this gap? Thank you.
So thank you very much about the incentive system to go to school and actually also about the skills, that are needed, at the secondary level. So we had a second student from India.
Very good evening. Very good evening, everyone. My name is Kavya Iyer. I am a Tamilian, but I've been brought up in Kolkata, West Bengal, and it was very interesting to see that West Bengal had the highest number of people paying for private tuitions, and I've seen that it's an absolutely massive phenomenon there. Thank you very much for your insights. So my question is somewhat related to what Jaya asked actually. Mr. Naidoo, you did mention a lot of times that apart from secondary education, there should be other means, or there should be other things that we need to provide. So I wanted you to sort of discuss what are these other things or other means that you were talking about, apart from the fact that secondary education alone might be a means of empowerment, especially among the lower income groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Earlier this week, the Minister for Human Resource Development was at UNESCO because the permanent delegation organized a conference on the zero. And I had a chance to speak to the minister. So I'm going to raise with Keith the number one issue that she had when she learned that I was from the International Institute for Educational Planning, part of UNESCO. She said that she really wants to do something about teacher supply, and so it's the last of your bullets, I think, on the bottom of your list of recommendations. She said that the existing institutions are really not doing the job, and that she felt there was a need for a national initiative to move on this. So if you had been with me, what might you have said to her? I imagine, first of all, that you would suggest that dealing with the small school size at secondary level would be part of the solution, of course. But what else besides that? Thank you.
Sure. I think probably I'll come back to Jordan in my closing remarks, and we'll get as many questions as we can out first. But thank you, Jordan. I think it was extremely helpful. The first question was about the incentives for children to enrol and remain in secondary schools. Now, India is a very large place, so anything I say will be true somewhere and not true somewhere else. But I don't quite see it in the way that you were presenting it. I think that the major obstacle on people continuing through secondary school is cost and it's failure. It's being unable to do the task put in front of you. So when we ask people about why they drop out, and we ask their teachers why they drop out, typically they say one of those two things. Either they can't afford it. The cost of attending a public secondary school in most states in India is at least 4 times that of a primary school. Because suddenly the household is confronted with a big shock. And of course will be asking itself, is it worth it? You know, what else can this boy or girl do? And they're also asking, what are their chances of going beyond grade 10, grade 12, or indeed getting to Delhi University? And for a lot of people, of course, the chance of getting to Delhi University will be 0. So they might well give up. But that's about a differentiated curriculum. I'll travel with you as far as a differentiated curriculum. But I think a lot of people wouldn't travel with you on the TBET question. It's very easy to advocate vocational courses for other people's children. If you want to destroy demand, do that, because that's not what people are demanding. They're demanding the opportunity to succeed in the core system first, and then may reconcile themselves to the so-called skill world. But I think it's more fundamental than that. If you have a sophisticated view of curriculum, then you will not separate vocational skills, whatever they are, from what secondary schools teach. It makes no sense. If you have a national curriculum, as was in one of my slides, you have to define the curriculum in terms where the knowledge and skill has utility, has some value. And there's no strict separation between the one and the other. This old idea of woodwork and metalwork. No, I mean, we live in a service sector economy in most states in India. People are doing IT. What kind of skill is that? That's a language skill, it's a comprehension skill. These are the stuff of the core curriculum, not something that's separate. So I don't travel quite with you on that. West Bengal, yes. I mean, what is this doing? I mean, ask your public intellectuals what this is doing to your society. You are raising the cost of selecting people. Everybody's doing private tuition, buying more and more of it. Increasingly, they're probably learning things which are of no utility. It's all about the test. It's learning to get a job, not learning to do a job. So the society is producing a huge overhead. Think of all the millions of hours of those children's time. All they're doing is studying away. And most of them are failing. The marginal benefit that they're getting. If private tuition works, then it advantages the rich. If it doesn't work, everybody's wasting their money. The state, has the opportunity not to outlaw it. I mean, these things are impossible. But you can improve the quality of the public system where people feel then that they won't get a bigger advantage. You can change the way you select people so that it is no longer true that people in Delhi a month ago in the newspaper were saying the mathematics test this year was unfair. We normally expect to get 97%. 97%? Yes, we normally expect to get 97%, and we only got 92. What's going on? Because the difference between a person who gets 93 and 95 on a maths test is not worth having. Doesn't justify selecting one over the other. None of these selection devices have a predictive validity study, which they should do, to demonstrate to parents that actually they're probably are wasting quite a lot of money. And the industry, of course, has an interest in convincing them otherwise. Where's the objective evidence? And lastly, what would I say to the Minister? I'd say yes, Minister. Absolutely. As well as I do. India doesn't have, first of all, it has a federal system, so the teacher training side of it is evolved at state level. But at state level, it's more often than not the case that nobody really does have a single database that tells you how many teachers there are in the state. They certainly don't have a single system of managing and administering the training colleges. And there are many different ways of becoming a teacher in India, some of which clearly don't involve a great deal of training. And the system, of course, is absolutely in need of integration, coordination, and repair. The most successful states are doing this. They're creating something that looks more recognizably like a system. But it's a long and vexed journey, and of course it's intimately tied up with the political economy of states, teachers unions, the fact that in many states teachers have reserved places in the legislative assembly, and so on and so on, and there's a lot of money involved. So it's a great question, and nobody on the planet can provide a simple answer, but work in progress it should certainly be.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps just on the question that was specific. Thanks. I think before I come to that question about the alternatives, just on the question of demand, I think unlike Keith, I've never worked in India and know very little about India from personal experience. But in terms of the work across Africa, I think the demand is there. We often underplay, the parents forego direct, they put up a lot of direct as well as opportunity costs in the hope that education offers the best path for mobility. And we see that all the time. And I think in some ways for many in India that may be true. I think depending on, the categories of people, I don't know how you define them, but I would think the demand is still extremely high, especially if we look at the messaging in both media and in other forms that it still posits education as the best means of mobility. So I question that doubt about the value and demand for education. Then in terms of the TVET question, I think that's an important question. And one of the things that was interesting from an IIO study is that the youth worker population ratio is actually highest for those with tech degrees and tech qualifications. And this is somewhat surprising for India. So I think the notion that TVET offers the pathway to employment and other opportunities is I think very misplaced. So that needs to be revisited. And I think given the nature of changing economies, whether you look at agriculture or even high tech, the skills the skill requirements have changed completely for every industry. I'm thinking of the experience in Ethiopia, for example. Even coffee farmers use mobile phones to check the futures market on a daily basis. So you can see that the things that we need to know, and one of the things in terms of skills, there's a big discussion around new literacies. What that means and how you provide that is a critical question. So I think when we look at the provision of, and this comes back to my question, to responding to the question on what I mean by different means of provision. I think it's not only always through formal secondary provision as we currently know it. And in fact, we know that even not for India, but most even developed systems, we are following models that were developed, in the times of industrial revolution, keep kids busy while their parents went to work for the first time. And we've not changed that model by and large. So that has to change for everyone. So I think we need to look at what are the skills needed, whether those abstract skills or even foundational skills, or you want to talk about 21st century skills, however you define them, that's the base. And then how do we provide that in a more efficient, effective, and equitable way, to use Keats' categorization.
Thank you very much. We can have a second round of questions. So there's Ralph who would like to ask a question. Who else? Okay, I don't know your name, but you're on the list. Two, a third one. Anybody would like to ask a third one? Then perhaps I will ask the third one now. Okay, Ralph, start.
Thank you very much. I'm Rao, as Michaela said. I'm a planning specialist with the Ministry of Education of Afghanistan. My question is about the perspective of equity. I'm sure it's not the first time that you hear this question. When we have this perspective of equity, by equity do we mean that there will be equitable result delivery, or there should be equitable service delivery? Because these two perspectives are quite different, and most likely it's opposite of each other. You cannot guarantee result delivery if you provide equitable service delivery, or if you want to concentrate on result delivery, you do not necessarily provide equitable services. So my question is, do the international commitments and international agenda is reflecting on equitable results, but still when we are translating it as planners into plans and into actions, we mistranslate it into equitable service delivery. For instance, the international agenda says that all the students should have access to let's say lower secondary or to secondary or primary. But when it comes to planning, we allocate the resources and we provide, for instance, incentives in equitable basis. What's the difference?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sakshi from India. So my question is more about the political will, because in India, education is a shared responsibility between the center and the state. And most of the time, the party at the center is different from the party at the state. Now that reflects upon how much the center is willing to put in for the social development. How can the international pressures be created at the state level, not the center level, because the center is in direct contact with the international system. But at the state level, how can that pressure be created so that the states are more motivated to fund education? For example, I'm from Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh does not want to fund education right now because that's not its priority, and the center is unable to put pressure on it because the parties at center and state are different. So my question is more about how to create political will. And the second is that if the core competencies are not developed at the when you're in primary education, even by universalizing secondary education, you're not creating core competencies. So the question goes back to how do we create core competencies at primary education? That needs to be India's agenda right now. The dropout rates will not fall till you don't create competencies.
Okay. Thank you very much. Two very interesting questions. I have a question about the demographic transition. Because on the one hand, there are two, one could call antagonistic movements. On the one hand, you know, the number of children of an age group will go down, but on the other hand, you will have a growing participation. So in order to estimate really the real impact of that, that needs, of course, a simulation and really to see which of the two trends takes precedence over the other one. And I wanted to know whether you had any opportunity really to look into the details of it. And a related question to this is the efficiency, of course, of the school network will be affected by that. The efficiency of the school network, which is one of the problems that you have these many small schools. And whether you had any opportunity really to pilot the school mapping exercise, let's say at the local level, and to see really what the future will bring. So on the one hand, you will have more demand for secondary education. On the other hand, you will have less children of an age group, and then you can look at these multiple schools which are available. So I would think that actually in order to address the problem, you really need a local planning exercise to really see whether it really makes sense to reduce the number of schools. So did you have any opportunity, despite the macro trends, really to look in the localities of it?
Yeah. Okay.
So we have three sets of questions here. The first one about equity, I'm probably not seeing the tension that was in. I remember the first director of the Institute of Development Studies, which I studied at, was a man called Dudley Sears, and he wrote a very well-known paper on the meaning of development. And he said within that, if your society is becoming more unequal, you are not developing. The definition of development has to include distributional aspects. It's perfectly possible for an unnamed country, I don't need to name it, where all the wealth is concentrated in the hands of one man. But divided across the population, it looks like a rich place that's developing. It isn't if all the wealth is owned by one person. And I think, no, let's stop there. My point is this, that the performance contracting that you're talking about should indeed attempt to assess equity, gains in opportunity, fairness. This is one thing the SDGs could do, that EFA didn't do. The original specification of Chontian and Dakar, none of it was distribution. None of it said, hey, it really does matter what the difference is between your best student and your worst student, or your highest pupil-teacher ratio and your lowest pupil-teacher ratio. You can design a system and a planning system which absolutely values that. It says that we're trying to make sure that every school has a pupil-teacher ratio within 5% of the average, that there will be no extremes. All high-performing systems do not have these extremes, remember that. Age and grade, which nobody's mentioned, but it's important. The reason why a lot of children don't get to secondary school in India is because by the time they get there to grade 8, they're 22 years old. They're young people with families and everything else. Now, all high-performing systems do not have age and grade problem. Andhra Pradesh, interestingly, got rid of most of its aging grade problem in one generation of school children. Bihar hasn't started. So, it is very doable. It's a partial answer to Jordan's question about whether these things are possible. Yes, they are. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So, I think we have to look very closely at the performance contracting side of planning and ask very hard questions. I've been discussing this with various people recently. One of the problems is indeed that if you have performance-related contracting, you have to ask what you're going to do when people fail. If you're going to give monetary reward or additional staff to schools that perform well, what are you going to do with schools that perform badly? Kill them? How long do they take to die? There's a real problem here of this oversimplified view, which again, Jordan, I can't resist. And I think you mentioned something about economists and the economists. This is full of people who believe that states are like people. They aren't. If I offer you $1,000 to go and make me a cup of tea, somebody in this room will say, I'll do that. I'll do that 10 times. Now, if I say that to UNESCO, to the Director General, I say, I'll give you $1,000. No chance. He's behaving like a state. Or his calculus of reward and benefit and the impact on his status that he got me a vote would be such that he wouldn't do it. You get my point, that we constructed our dialogue about choice, for example, as if everybody chooses, and it's an SDG point. It's an SDG point that if you have choice, you must have inefficiency. You can only have choice if you have more capacity than you can use, because you have to have somewhere to go. But if you're going to design a school system around high levels of school choice, then you're going to be paying for a lot of empty seats, not only to make the choice possible, but also to maintain the possibility in the future of schools going up and down in competition with each other. Very inefficient. It might serve some other purpose, but I think it's a complex set of things. But I think ultimately it's an SDG question. It's about the meaning of development and whether you see distribution and equity as part of the definition of development, or whether you see it as a byproduct or an accidental outcome. I know where I sit on it. The question of the federal nature of the Indian state, of course, I mean, this is a constitutional problem. The reality is that the federal government has very little power. I mean, it's not delivering the service. It may, in some sense, be financing it, but as you may well know, that the financial system in the states has become a lot less earmarked. It really is the states that decide to do with their money. The centre is no longer telling them you have to spend it on secondary school, you have to spend it on primary school. It's saying, here is the money, you decide, and the states make different decisions. So the answer to your question is indeed about the state level politics of who wants what kind of secondary schooling or primary schooling. And the states make very different decisions, but I think perhaps even more importantly, within states, the difference is if you put them in the public domain, they create pressure to reduce the differences. So it's one thing to tell somebody, or to say to somebody in Bihar, do you realise how different Bihar is to Kerala? To which they may say, well, I don't care, I don't live in Kerala, I live in Bihar. But if you say there is a block, a private block just down the road, which is where your chances of getting secondary school are 1/10 of yours. Well, that's more exciting stuff, I think, that plays out in an information-rich society. And your demographic transition, I guess, haven't got much time for it, but I think it creates a great opportunity, actually, in general. Because although it's true in some places, of course, it's still growing. The big picture of this is that never in the history of the world have so many societies been addressing demographic decline, a relatively smaller proportion of children in relation to working adults who can finance school.
Just on that question of the state level, I think in terms of the SDG discussions, it's been quite interesting that we are getting individual ministers from state level reaching out to us for support on SDGs. And this is an interesting thing, and this is happening in a number of countries, not only India, where there are state level or provincial level consultations around setting up mechanisms for moving forward the SDGs, even as you get the national structures which in a sense will be quite ineffective. I think they just will play a political coordination role with regard to reporting at the UN level. But in terms of the action that needed to be taken, it is at the local level. So, for example, in India, we've had outreach from the Minister from Andhra Pradesh and a few others, requesting assistance at a state level, which is quite unusual from previous interactions because it's always been through the national ministry.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're coming to the end of the strategic debate. I think it was a debate, and you have talked to each other very nicely and with all your expertise and knowledge. And I'm still not sure whether SDG 4 is achievable, but that's enough. So we need a third strategic debate. But I'm sure that we have seen a very interesting analysis of the current situation, secondary education in India, and a thorough analysis, many issues, and quite an interesting set also of possible policy recommendations to address some of these issues. So I think again we should clap our speakers. And I would like to invite you all cordially to a cocktail that we have in the basement. So this is, of course, the opportunity to continue our discussion and also to have friendly talks. So see you there then.
Can I just I didn't answer Jordan's core question, and I will. The answer is yes. That every country that's in a normal state of civil society, that is not at war and economically non-viable, is perfectly capable of delivering secondary schooling to all its school-age children. There are many historical examples of countries that have done this. Somebody from Sri Lanka had an intervention. Well, Sri Lanka had universal secondary schooling about 30 or 40 years ago, pretty much, at the 80 to 90% level, when it was a poor country. It's not wealth-related, it's about organisation of politics. But it has no point unless there is some engagement with the content of secondary schooling. And what it does, if you're learning meaningless things, it won't help your society develop. Is it achievable? Or financially, absolutely. Providing you collect more than about 15 to 20% of GDP in tax to run your government, you can afford it. If you collect 5%, of course you can't. You can't afford anything. Financially, you can do it. Demographically, absolutely. It's getting easier because the numbers are getting less. And of course, it's helpful if you have economic growth. Curriculum, absolutely. I think everybody in this room is an educator of one kind or another. Are you going to say it's impossible to design a great secondary school curriculum? Absolutely not. Of course it's possible. It's a goal that we should strive for when we see, when we were working on the SEI Day in Africa, I guess about more than half the countries had secondary school curricula that were at least 20 years old, maybe even 30 or 40 years. This is inexcusable. I mean, the opportunity is there to get under the SDGs. Whether the political will is there, I think, is the core question. Because secondary schooling is about how societies stratify themselves. It is about who gets what. It is about how those who get it legitimate the difference between those who have it and those who don't. And there you have a point of departure about the meaning of development. What kind of society do you want to live in, and what kind of society is it? I'll leave you with one thing for the reception. It's a simple question. Just name one thing that every child who leaves the secondary school should know and be able to do. That's a critical question. It should be the question of the SDGs. You could answer it in terms of what is a 21st century skill. Some people will know I have a prize that's not been won, $100. You can tell me it's a 21st century skill that is not a 20th century skill. The prize is still available. You could answer it like this. I showed you this before. First image of the Earth. As soon as you see that, It conveys all sorts of development messages and sustainable development messages. But you could answer it in a slightly different way. You could say, well, is there anybody else out there like us? This is something you can do with no money, but the poorest child in the poorest place on the planet can look upwards and they will see that. That's the Milky Way. But knowing what the Milky Way is, finding out about it, is something that everybody should know and do. And it contains within the idea, all sorts of things to do with analytic thinking skills and so on. And it costs nothing. You don't need a laboratory. It's all available one way or another in what we know. But it tells you there are 300 billion stars in the Milky Way. Stars like our sun. If you look a bit further than that, you can just see this with a naked eye if you're in a very dark part of Africa. On a very clear night, you can see Andromeda. Andromeda is a galaxy. It has around about 200, there are about 200 other galaxies, 200 billion other galaxies, like Andromeda. You can see we have a very, very large number here. And to finish my story, that's looking back in time. This is looking out into the universe. This group of galaxies are around about 12 billion years old. The light has taken that long to get here. You can't see that, but we can. It's telling you a story about the origin of the universe, the origin of life. And the key thing for the SDGs is this. Here's a very simple equation that every 15-year-old should be able to do. N is the number of places where you might find people, life, intelligent life. The equation is that. It's a simple linear equation. If you can do algebra at secondary school level, you will understand. Everybody should be able to do it. The problem with the equation is L, big L. And we don't have time, we won't go into detail, but these are the things. The average rate of star formation, the number of stars that have planets, and so on. Now, if you work that all out, you come to L. L is that, it is the bottom here. And L is the length of time that a civilization survives. If that number is 100 years, there's nobody out there. There was no sustainable development. Societies that reach the level we are at destroy themselves one way or another. Pollution, nuclear power, conflict. And we'll never hear from them because they will die. And we will die. If that number is 1,000, or rather if that number is 1,000,000, then there is somebody else. This is something that can be understood by any secondary school child and with your thinking skills. So I invite you to discuss it over the reception.
A closure and an opening. Thank you so much. Yeah, the power can be used.